So both your grandfathers died before you were born.
Right.
Do you know how old Renee and Nate were when they lost their fathers?
Nate was young. He was the youngest of 3 children. And he was like 6 or 7 years old. And his mother supported the family by running what they called a dry goods store, which I'm not exactly sure what that was, but it was a store that probably sold towels and sheets and stuff like that. That's how she supported the family. And I don't know how my maternal grandmother supported the family. When her
Except
husband,
for renting out.
the rent, except for renting out, I don't know if any other source of income. Now, the paternal grandmother wasn't running a dry goods store at the point I came along, because my mother and father got married quite late for that time.
Mm-hmm.
My father was 40, and my mother was 30. That was late for both of them. It was first marriage for both of them.
So Nate, at age 40, moved into his new bride's mother's house.
No, first they had an apartment in Cambridge.
But then.
And then they moved into Renee's mother's house, renting the second floor. But she was the opposite of a meddling mother-in-law. Like, we get together on holidays, but there was no regular having meals with her, hanging out with her, anything like that.
So you think Nate felt okay about this?
Oh yeah, she wasn't a the friction was entirely between Renee, my mother, and her mother-in-law and her sister-in-law, who she felt resented her enormously for taking away the only man in their life, which was my father.
Her sister-in-law being Martha.
Mm-hmm. She really didn't like her.
Renee really didn't like Martha.
Oh, really? Yes.
Did it go both ways, do you think?
Martha did a good job of never saying anything negative about my mother to me. But because my mother was actually mean to her, she would make mean kind of remarks about her in front of her on the rare occasion when she had her to our house. And Martha was not a stupid woman. She had to have felt that resentment. But she was smart enough to never say anything to me about it.
Were they of similar social classes? Renee and Nate?
That's a good question. Generally similar, I would say. Except I think that my mother came from a family that valued education more than my father's family valued more like just making a living. Although my father had attempted to get an education. I don't know if you know that. He actually spent a semester in law school, which in that time, you could go to law school without going to college.
Mm-hmm.
And he went to law school because virtually all of his friends were Irish Catholic, because he played football in high school. And all the football players were Irish Catholic, except for my father. And they became his friends. And a lot of them became politicians in Boston, of whom the best known one was Tip O'Neill, was actually his friend.
Just to back
If you
up
know,
for
do you know
a
who Tip
second.
O'Neill?
Yeah.
Okay.
Before we talk more about Nate, do you know his family going any farther back? Did they also say they came from Odessa?
They never said anything.
And so you assume they came around the same time, and you don't know why?
I think that Aunt Betty was born in Russia. Whether Martha was or not, I don't know, but my father was born in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Both of these grandmothers, I can remember this very vividly. When they weren't cooking was the main thing, but when they weren't cooking, they were reading the Jewish Forward, which was a Yiddish newspaper. And what was very interesting to me about that newspaper, because I've always been interested in language, is it didn't, the letters, which I believe were Hebrew letters, but maybe not, I'm not 100% sure about that. Anyhow, there weren't vowels. There didn't seem to be vowels.
Is that a progressive Jewish newspaper?
No, it was like the newspaper of the Jewish immigrants in this country. They all read the Jewish Forward. And they all hung out just with each other to the extent that they hung out and weren't cooking. and they raised their children, and but it was a very insular kind of thing. They weren't hanging out with their Irish neighbors. They weren't. They were homebodies.
But then Nate was hanging out with a lot of Irish people.
Yes, he was. That generation was. Yeah.
Was Renee also?
You know, she almost never mentioned friends. The person she was closest to was her older sister Billy, who she idolized. Billy was more like a mother to her than her own mother. And even when Billy married and moved to California, they wrote each other letters like weekly.
But if her mother was so warm, then why wasn't she more of a mother to Renee?
Well, I don't know. I wasn't there when she was raising Renee. I mean, maybe she was tired. She'd raised 4 children. One of them died. That must have been tough. And I'm not sure at what point the husband died. And when I asked what he died of, I was told something. I remember I was told he died of Burgess disease, which I never heard of, but that seemed to be some circulatory thing related to smoking. That's what I was told. He died young. Both of them died young.
And how did Nate and Renee meet?
I don't know.
You just know he was 40 and she was 30.
Yeah.
He was ready to take a wife. She was very pretty.
She was very pretty.
What was she doing? She didn't go to college, you said.
Right. She was working. She was working as a secretary for a newspaper. I think that's what she was doing. She always worked. And she was pretty but very high strung. And he was very easygoing. So that was maybe the attraction of the way that they got along.
And what kind of work was he doing?
So he had a job that I don't think exists anymore. He had his own business. Some people called that business being a jobber. So what he would do is he would sell goods, a variety of goods ranging from men's shirts and ties to television sets, which he would get from friends of his that owned stores. The one you might remember is Alvin. I don't know if you remember Alvin Mendelsohn had a men's store in Boston. And so Alvin would be the source of men's clothing. And Grandpa Nate had a series of customers, and he would sell to them on credit, on what he called the installment plan. And then he'd go around and he'd collect from them on a weekly basis. So let's say you bought a television set for $100 at that time. You might pay him $10 a week till it was paid off, or $10 a month, plus interest, obviously.
Were they both Jewish? I mean, observant Jews?
My father wanted to keep a kosher home. That was important to him. And my mother did not want to keep a kosher home. And so
She did not want to because of the work or the religion or both?
I think the work, and she hadn't been brought up in a kosher home. So it's like a lot of work if you haven't been brought up in it and you don't buy into that that's what you should be doing. That was very important to him. So they reached a compromise that always struck me as kind of silly, but it seemed to work for them. And her compromise was, because when you're keeping a kosher home, one of the big tenets is that you cannot mix milk with meat. It comes from a biblical prohibition, thou shalt not eat the kid in his mother's milk. And she said when they had children, they had to drink milk, because at that time it was believed that you should have 3 glasses of milk minimum every day growing up while you were a child, or your growth would be stunted or something. I remember that very clearly because I don't happen to like milk, just drinking it plain. And so she served only kosher meat with a glass of milk. It was like the complete opposite. But then he wasn't drinking the milk with it, and he was eating only kosher meat. So that's what she did.
Jeff mentioned to me that Nate would get picked on sometimes for being the only Jew in the neighborhood. Did you ever hear stories about that?
Never.
You never felt any anti-Semitism or anything?
You mean
going
when he was growing up or when we were growing up?
I think he was saying when Nate was growing up and he was on the football team, stuff like that.
Oh, he never told me that.
I think that's what Jeff said. I'm not sure.